Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going deep on two pretty major things happening right now. First, U.S. politics,
Yeah.
and second, all the stuff going on with those Middle East negotiations.
Right.
So,
Oh,
much to cover. Big thanks to everyone who sent in all these articles.
yeah, some fascinating stuff.
It's like having a direct line to what's really going on, you know?
I know,
Like,
right.
like having coffee with your friend who just happens to be really in the loop.
Yeah, the one here.
So let's jump right in. One thing that really grabbed my attention, reading through all this stuff on Trump's economic policies, was how much discussion there is
Mm.
about comparing it to, like, the 1980s.
Ah, interesting. Yeah, I see that coming up a lot too.
But with the totally modern spin, of course.
Of course, of course. I mean, that's the big question, isn't it?
Right.
Will this actually lead to growth, or is it just, going to make inequality even worse?
It's a bit of a gamble, to be honest.
Exact.
And it really depends on which economist you're talking to.
It does. Some are saying it's revolutionary. Some are calling it a complete disaster.
Oh, yeah, I saw those articles too.
It's wild. But that whole 1980s thing, it's smart, right? It
Right.
plays right into what people remember what they're worried about.
Oh, yeah.
But things are different now,
Yep,
You
it's
can't just do a copy-paste job. We've got globalization now, tech disruption. It's a whole different ballgame.
Whole different ball game.
Oh,
Speaking of shaking things up,
yeah.
we got to talk about those House committee chair races.
Oh, yeah. Those are getting interesting.
For anyone who needs a quick explainer, basically, these races determine who gets to lead these powerful committees in the House of Representatives.
Right. And they have a lot of influence over what legislation actually makes it to the floor, what gets voted on.
Exactly. So they have a huge impact on the balance of power, whether things swing more one way or the other.
Absolutely. And there are some really heated races this year.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
any particularly spicy ones that caught your eye?
Definitely. The one for the Energy and Commerce Committee is a total nail-biter.
Oh, yeah, I highlighted that one too. Huge implications for like climate policy and all that.
Exactly. One article called it like a proxy war for the future of climate policy.
I think that was the one from the Atlantic, maybe.
Yeah, could be. And what's really fascinating is you've got this like relatively unknown challenger.
Really?
Yeah. Barely 40 years old, going up against this total veteran, like decades in Washington.
Wow, David and Goliath situation.
Kind of, yeah. And what's driving this newcomer is all about renewable energy, tech innovation.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's like that generational divide we're seeing everywhere playing out right there in Congress.
Makes you think about what that means for the future, right? Not just for the U.S., but for like the whole world.
Absolutely, yeah.
The ripple effect.
Speaking of the world, gotta talk about the Middle East.
Oh, boy.
It feels like, anytime we talk about that region, it always comes back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
It's hard to avoid, right?
Yeah. But this potential truce between Israel and Hezbollah that you pointed out,
Right.
that feels different.
It does, yeah. I mean, one of the articles even said it could redefine the geopolitical chessboard.
A little dramatic, maybe, but I get the point.
Right. So, like, is that just hype, or is there really something to that?
I think there's definitely something to it. Hezbollah is a big deal in Lebanon.
Right.
They've got those close ties to Iran,
Right, right.
So a truce with Israel, that could really shift things in the region.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But as your articles pointed out, it's super delicate.
Oh, yeah. Tons of history there.
A lot of mistrust.
Exactly.
And you can bet there are people on both sides who are not going to be happy about any kind of compromise.
Yeah, for sure. The articles really got into those internal pressures. It's not just like two big, unified groups making a deal.
Yeah, no, not at all.
It's way more complicated than that.
It's all these different factions, different interests, all pushing and pulling.
Which makes me wonder, like, are we even using the right words here?
What do you mean?
Is truce even the right word? Or is it something, like, more nuanced?
That's a really good question. And yeah, your articles kind of danced around that too. Some people prefer detente, less formal, just easing tensions.
Right.
Others are saying strategic accommodation, which sounds very official.
Well.
But at the end of the day, it's not about the label.
Sure.
It's about what's actually happening on the ground. What are they willing to give up? And even more importantly, what are they absolutely not willing to budge on?
So much to think about. It feels like, no matter what we call it, this whole thing in the Middle East, it's a big turning point.
Absolutely.
And it's hard not to see how it could affect everything else, especially with those U.S. elections coming up.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think, like, whoever wins those House committee seats, could they actually influence how the U.S. approaches this whole truce thing?
I think they could, yeah. The U.S. has always been a big player in the Middle East.
Right, for sure.
trying to, mediate, broker deals, all that. And like we were talking about earlier, who's in charge of those committees can really change U.S. foreign policy. If it's those younger, more progressive folks, we might see a different approach, more diplomacy, working with other countries.
Interesting.
But if those committees stay with, the more hawkish people, then things might not change much. Or maybe they'll get even more assertive.
So many possibilities. I feel like the big takeaway here is that these things, U.S. politics, the Middle East, they're all connected.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
What happens in one place definitely affects the other.
Exactly. Well, on that note, any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
Yeah, just something to keep in mind as you keep reading about all this. Think about the economic side of things.
Okay.
Those debates about Trump's economic policies, especially the stuff about globalization and trade.
Right.
How might that affect the U.S.'s ability to, be an effective mediator in the Middle East?
That's a good question to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new, maybe even got some new questions brewing.
Always good to have more questions.
It's a complex world out there, and staying informed, it's an ongoing thing. Thanks for being here with us.